As the death toll in Libya soars, families struggle to bury their dead, and destroyed roads make relief efforts even harder.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy meets with the Ukrainian Jewish community in Kyiv ahead of the religious Rosh Hashanah celebrations.
A year on from the death of Mahsa Amini in Iran, the protests have faded, but some resistance to the hijab continues. The UN has launched an initial appeal for over 66 million euros to help 250,000 people worst hit by the catastrophic floods in Libya, which have claimed thousands of lives. Residents of the Libyan city of Derna have been burying bodies in mass graves, but still they line the streets, and officials say the death toll could triple.
So I cannot really confirm the final numbers, but it's really a high level of magnitude, and I'm afraid we will hear really large numbers, maybe even more than what has been confirmed so far.
Libya's Eastern administration in Benghazi city approved a budget of 10 billion dinars, nearly 2 billion euros, and Parliament announced the formation of a committee to manage the aftermath of the floods. Over 11,300 people are now confirmed to have died in the disaster. Thousands more could be buried under drifts of mud and concrete, and rescuers have struggled to bring in heavy equipment on the destroyed roads.
Volodymyr Zelenskyy meeting representatives of Ukraine's Jewish community in Kyiv. More than 20,000 Jewish pilgrims have travelled from Israel to Ukraine's Uman, one of the birthplaces of the Hasidic movement, ahead of Rosh Hashanah, despite warnings from Kyiv not to travel due to the Russian invasion. Later in his evening address, Zelenskyy announced the opening of the office of the International Criminal Court in Ukraine.
В Україні запрацював польовий офіс Міжнародного кримінального суду. І це найбільше представництво суду за межами Гааги. Саме така співпраця допомагає нам наближати момент відновлення справедливості для України і усіх наших людей, які постраждали від цієї війни. Момент законних і заслужених вироків для російських злочинців.
Ukrainian authorities on Telegram say they have ordered evacuations of civilians in the Kherson region, partly controlled by Russian forces and regularly targeted by shelling. The Kherson governor also indicated that regional authorities were preparing for emergency situations this coming autumn and winter for electricity supplies, as the Ukrainian offensive enters its fourth month.
From Russian custody to the Dutch capital, 6 Ukrainian children have arrived in The Hague to give testimony about their abduction and forced deportation during the war. They were greeted by teddy bears, mascots of the movement fighting for the return of abducted Ukrainian children. Euronews spoke with 2 heavily traumatized children who spent months held by the Russians. 14-year-old Veronica lived near Kharkiv when the war broke out. When she decided to flee her house, the only way led her to Russia, where she ended up in a closed refugee camp and where, soon after, her forced integration began.
Це в вересні того року, то в першій школі мені казали по типу, що із-за тебе та твоєї України наших батьків мобілізують. Тобто це все із-за тебе. І так було там часто, та іноді говорили те, що я все розумію, тому що я з України. Тобто, я трішки відставала від їхньої учоби.
Veronica came back to Ukraine after 9 months. Her return was extremely difficult because her mother was serving in the Ukrainian army and because of the stress she suffered from an hormonal disease. 17-year-old Ivan lived in an orphan home in Mariupol. When he fled the bombings, he was captured by Russian forces and transferred to a hospital in the occupied Donetsk region.
До начала войны я жил со своими мечтами. Я мечтал добиться успеха в каком-то спорте, футбол, бокс. Я постоянно ходил на тренировки разные, учился. И когда началась война, когда я приехал уже с Донецка сюда, я потерял это чувство чего-то добиться, не знаю. Я пытаюсь себя сейчас поддерживать. На самом деле очень морально тяжело. То, что я пережил, оно все равно оно никуда не уйдет. Этот камень останется навсегда. На жаль, то, что я застал это свое детство таким, но надеюсь, у других детей, те, которые этого не видели, будет все хорошо и отлично.
Veronica and Ivan are among the 386 Ukrainian miners who were returned to their homeland. But the government in Kiev have identified another 19,546 Ukrainian children who have been forcibly deported.
Seriously, I can't say a lot of details, but I can mention that the procedure of returning Ukrainian children back absolutely hard and blocked from Russian side. So we did a lot, and I suppose we will do a lot.
In early 2023, the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant against Russian President Vladimir Putin because of the unlawful deportation of Ukrainian children.
The ECB raises interest rates again by 1/4 point to 4.5%, the highest in 2 decades. The measure, in the midst of economic stagnation, should curb inflation in the euro area. In addition, the ECB has lowered its growth forecasts in the eurozone for the years 2023 to 2025.
Inflation continues to decline, but is still expected to remain too high for too long. We are determined to ensure that inflation returns to our 2% medium-term target in a timely manner. In order to reinforce progress towards our target, the Governing Council today decided to raise the 3 key ECB interest rates by 25 basis points.
This is the 10th consecutive increase in the cost of borrowing, despite signs of wear and tear in the economy. The European Commission predicts average Eurozone GDP growth of 0.8% this year, with forecasts ranging from 2.2% for Spain to minus 0.4% for Germany. They predict inflation won't fall to 2.1% until 2025, with Commission President Ursula von der Leyen identifying persistent high inflation as a great economic challenge for the bloc.
Off the southwest coast of Britain, on the surface of the North Atlantic Ocean, scientists from the Marine Biological Association have been observing alarming sea surface temperatures. A constant concern, but this year more than ever. At the beginning of the summer, temperatures were up to 5 degrees warmer than the average.
Sea temperatures are still almost 2 degrees higher than the long-term average, and they've been high pretty much all of this year.
The team hasn't just been observing the temperatures, but for over a decade, the kelp in this part of southwest England. And earlier this summer, the temperatures were so alarming to push the kelp to the limit of what it can cope with. And that matters because it's the foundation of the marine ecosystems that surround Britain.
A few degrees doesn't sound like very much, but from a marine environment which is relatively very thermally stable, that could potentially have a huge impact. But that's what some of our research is hoping to find out.
The team has been running experiments on the health of kelp and seagrass, both in the sea and in the laboratory, to see what's likely to happen if the trend continues. Seagrass being examined in current and projected future water temperatures.
This year in particular, the North Atlantic has been alarmingly warm. Ocean warming and marine heat waves are going to ramp up over the coming years to decades, with huge consequences for fisheries, for aquaculture, for the conservation of marine ecosystems.
Kelp and seagrass support ecosystems around Europe exactly the same way as coral does. But unlike coral, kelp is found in huge quantities across the globe.
It does feel like climate Armageddon might be getting that a little bit closer, and some of the things that we've considered to be almost fantasy and science fiction are at risk of happening within our lifetimes.
Data collated by Copernicus, the Earth observation component of the European Union's space programme, highlights 2023 as an alarming year in terms of sea surface temperature.
We've seen examples in the Pacific where we've had die-offs and big oxygen low zones associated with the warming. And it wouldn't be untrue to say that we may be on the edge of seeing that around the UK and European seas as well.
As temperatures test the foundations of marine ecosystems, scientists continue to analyse what's in store in the short term and what the oceans could look like for future generations. Luke Hanrahan, Euronews, Plymouth.
It's been 1 year since the death of Mahsa Amini and the renewed fight for women's rights in Iran. The 23-year-old Kurdish woman died while in police custody in Tehran. She was allegedly arrested for not wearing a hijab correctly. News of her death went viral across social media platforms, sparking national and international protests. Millions of people around the world called for Tehran's theocratic leaders to step down, but the authorities responded with force. Thousands of demonstrators were arrested while access to the internet and social networks was heavily restricted. The regime accused the United States, Israel and their agents of fueling the protests. The West responded with sanctions. But the protest movement continued to gain momentum, and the slogan "Women, Life, Freedom" was heard in every corner of the country. In the weeks that followed, there were hundreds more deaths, including members of the security forces. Tens of thousands of people were arrested, and some protesters were sentenced to death for their part in the protests. In February, the government declared an unprecedented amnesty, but a number of girls' schools suffered mysterious attacks with toxic gases. Fingers of blame pointed to extreme elements within the regime, which officially condemned the events. Repression returned and the protests faded. Determined to reimpose the use of the hijab in public spaces, the government toughened laws and re-established the controversial morality police. But as some women go out without the veil, the memory of Mahsa Amini remains alive. And the police presence has increased to coincide with the first anniversary of her death.